In this presentation, prepared by Millen Verma, Emma Yarborough, Megan Toomey, and Rebecca Smoot, we will be examining the economic impacts that COVID-19 is having on the EU. We took an in-depth look at each region, the East, the West, the South, and the Nordic, then detailed how COVID affected these countries' economies and how they responded. First, we will be looking at Eastern Europe, predominantly Estonia, Hungary, and Poland. The Estonian government was quick to close schools and workplaces, as well as ban public gatherings and place restrictions on travel. Their most affected sector due to the virus has been the tourism sector. The Tallinn airport saw drops in flights, the port in Tallinn experienced a downturn, and the hospitality sector saw many cancellations and drops in booking. However, Estonia has been praised for their use of e-health and technology in combating the virus. While the tourism sector has taken a huge hit, their technology sector is still operating and has revolutionized to fit the current circumstances. In the form of state aid, the government has provided businesses and corporations with money to help stay afloat. The Estonian government provided 75.5 million euros in direct grants and payment advantages to companies affected by the pandemic. In the most recent news, on October 7th, the Commission approved a 1.5 million euro Estonian scheme to support the food processing sector. Taking advantage of its very low public debt, the government adopted a relatively large stimulus package of over 4% of the GDP. Public debt is forecast to jump from 8.4% of GDP in 2019 to over 22% of GDP by 2021, which would still be the lowest in the EU. Hungary, like much of Europe, closed and canceled public gatherings early on to try to stop the spread of the virus. But as daily case numbers are beginning to spike again, they're looking into how they can try and keep their economy from falling. In the second quarter of 2020, the Hungarian economy fell by 14.5%, impacted by the lockdown and closure of many parts of their economy. Industrial production fell by 29% as well, but it has been making a recovery throughout the summer as manufacturing plants went back into production. The sectors hit most by the virus were tourism, the entertainment industry, transport and automotive industry, and the financial sector. The government imposed a delay on all repayments on corporate and household loans this year, and the central bank launched a series of steps to provide liquidity for banks. In June, the government launched a 137 billion forint, approximately 398 million euros, loan scheme for small businesses. Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that his government was drafting a war plan to defend against the second wave of the pandemic. The plan's aim was not for everyone to stay at home and bring the country to a halt, but to defend Hungary's functionality. They're expected to benefit from the recently agreed upon Next Generation EU Recovery Fund and the EU's next multi-annual financial framework. According to estimates from Oxford Economics, Hungary is expected to receive around 8.6 billion euros in grants from the Economic Recovery Fund. This is going to provide a stimulus to the Hungarian economy equal to some 6.7% of GDP from 2021 to 2025. Now let's discuss Poland, one of the bigger states in Eastern Europe. 75% of Poland's electrical power comes from coal mines. The coronavirus has crippled Poland's coal industry, as many have had to close for periods of time. In July, it was estimated that around a fifth of the confirmed infections in Poland were from miners. As with much of other Eastern European companies, the automotive industry in Poland has taken a huge hit. Manufacturing across all key car companies fell to a record low of April in this year. Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki introduced a stimulus package of approximately $51.5 billion to mitigate economic damage. He said that the package would be focused on boosting infrastructure and healthcare spending to help struggling companies pay salaries to avoid layoffs and allow them to defer Social Security payments. The package consists of 5 pillars: employee safety, company financing, health protection, strengthening the financial system, and a public investment program. Also, the European Commission has adopted a temporary framework to let European Union member states use flexibility in support of the economy. This was amended on April 3rd, 2020, and provides 7 different types of aid, ranging from direct grants to subsidized public loans to monetary support and COVID-related research and development. The European Council approved Poland for an approximately €115 million scheme to help support their economy. Spain. Western Europe was one of the first regions to record official cases and be dramatically affected by COVID. As a result, most of these countries instituted countrywide shutdowns in the early months of the pandemic. These shutdowns included schools, workplaces, shops, non-essential activities, etc. Some states, such as Germany, began slowly reopening some sectors of the economy as early as April, whereas other states, such as Spain, did not begin their phase of reopening until late June. Other states, like Belgium, instituted 3-phase plans in which they reopened certain sectors one after another while monitoring the number of cases. In some cases, such as France, local regions and governments were allowed to make their own decisions concerning when to open. When it comes to which sectors were most affected in the Western European region, most cases show that the hospitality and tourism industries were hit the hardest. This is because most of the states either restricted or majorly reduced international travel. While some states later reopened travel back up to Schengen states, this did not necessarily recover the economy in the ways that were needed. Additionally, this pandemic forced many citizens to lose their jobs and small businesses to be drastically affected. Most governments in Western Europe began instituting policies meant to aid these struggling communities. For example, in Belgium, the government instituted a plan to protect businesses from bankruptcies during this period. In the majority of these states, governments implemented stimulus packages for individuals and businesses to sustain themselves for the time being. Finally, because many have been hospitalized during this pandemic, most of these states have been heavily focusing on investing in and prioritizing healthcare aid. For Southern Europe, we're going to be taking a look at the smaller states to see what toll COVID took on those that receive much less press. Southern Europe extends along the Mediterranean Sea. We'll start with Bosnia and Herzegovina. The economy of this small country has been hit particularly hard during this pandemic. The government of the Federation of BiH is allocating around €50 million to different parts of its economy to help sectors that are being affected through the COVID. Tourism is getting the biggest cut of this money, with agriculture, transport, and energy sectors also getting a large sum. Trade in BiH has also been extremely affected, with a decrease of 14.1% in exports in the month of August alone. Malta is a completely different case. At the beginning of COVID, their totals were very, very low, but now they're starting to spike. Malta is considered a high-income country because its economy is driven by innovation. It has a very sound financial foundation, largely in part to infrastructure projects and domestic demand. In 2020, the GDP is expected to fall by 2.8%, but the economy is expected to recover in 2021 with a predicted increase of 35.7%. This summer, the Minister of the Economy in Malta extended the COVID wage supplement throughout the months to help cover wage costs that were incurred because of COVID. This support from the government has helped the economy stay afloat during these trying times. And again in Greece, a completely different case. The island nation has been facing its own economic struggles even before COVID hit. And now, with more than 25,000 cases reported and a new spike occurring, Greece's economy is continuing to be impacted. The first package to help Greece's suffering economy was close to €18 billion, which was distributed to help off laid-off workers and their companies. Now, a new package is about to be passed to continue to help the Greek economy stay afloat. Another €10 billion are going to be used to help continue to support these Greek businesses and workers. This is expected to last through the end of 2020. Between the government's swift actions taken to combat the virus and their dynamic economy, Greece is looking at an 8% recession this year. With everything considered in Greece, especially the path they were on before COVID, this could have gone much worse for the country. Now time for the Nordic states. The Nordic region's economy has undergone lots of pressure and damage due to the coronavirus. But when you compare it to other European regions that we've examined, the Nordics have suffered the least. When the virus infiltrated southern Europe, Denmark and Norway were some of the first states to lock down and begin to install precautions. Finland did the same about a week later, and Sweden initiated a hands-off response, one they called folkvett, which means trusting the common sense of the people. More on that later. Denmark's economic response in March was extremely aggressive. After shutting down nearly the entire country, the Danish government pledged that they would pay 75% of employees' salaries to sidestep the inevitable dip in unemployment. Denmark essentially froze their economy for 3 months and dished out an enormous amount of salary relief. This swift decision seems to have paid off, as Denmark became the first EU country to reopen public schools. They also reopened its restaurants, hairdressers, shops, museums, and zoos with haste. The biggest hit to Denmark's economy came from exports, but luckily, their exports rely on pharmaceuticals and food, predominantly fish, which do not take as much of a hit as neighboring countries' exports because of how recession-proof those two industries are. With their GDP having fallen 7.4% in the second economic quarter, Denmark has put aside $1.5 billion in their Danish War Chest, which is a fund designated for assisting struggling companies, the healthcare system, and securing a COVID-19 vaccine. Sweden, on the contrary, could not have closed their economy if they wanted to, due to the fact that their constitution states that a state of emergency cannot be declared during peacetime. The government recommended that people social distance and wear masks, but they were still incapable of issuing any hard laws. Although their economy remained open, they still did take hits due to a large portion of the global economy shutting down, and because their economy relies heavily on industrial exports, which went down in demand. Interestingly, Sweden's decrease in spending during the first 6 months of the pandemic was only 4% less than Denmark's. To aid this decrease in spending, the Swedish government pledged $570 million in aid to small businesses to make up for the projected 75% of lost income from March to July. In the second economic quarter, Sweden's unemployment rate rose to 9.4%, highest among the Nordics, and their GDP fell by 8.6%, also highest among the Nordics. Finland's approach to the coronavirus was, like Denmark's, to shut down quickly and reopen quickly. Finland was perhaps the most prepared country in the world for this moment, as they had been stockpiling medical supplies and masks since World War II. This was a relief for both the people and the government, as it provided equipment for citizens and spared the government hundreds of millions of dollars in PPE that so many other countries had had to dish out. Their quick to shut down, quick to reopen plan was executed as intended, as schools reopened in mid-May and restaurants and public facilities reopened in early June. The biggest hit their economy took was from exports. They made nearly 28% less money off exports in the second quarter than they did in 2019. However, their GDP only ended up decreasing by 3.2%, the lowest among the Nordics. To soothe some of this loss, the government granted 400 million euros towards a funding program that is built to ensure that medium-sized businesses negatively affected by the virus stay in business. Per most COVID-affected countries, Finland stomached the largest rise in unemployment and temporary layoffs that it has seen in decades. Norway's government imposed state of emergency sanctions to close the government from the beginning months of the coronavirus. By late April, the economy began to gradually reopen, and by mid-June, the majority of businesses were up and running again, including schools and bars. All of these had a mandatory 1-meter separation rule. Norway's largest export is oil, and unfortunately, global oil prices were significantly low when the virus hit. In the second quarter, their economy shrunk 6.3%. This was more than Denmark and Finland, but less than Sweden. Relative to the Eurozone, whose average reduction in GDP was 12.1% in the second quarter, Norway found itself in relatively good shape. The oil crisis severely affected them in the first few months, but thanks to their government's $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, they've been able to spin their way out of the hole that they were dropped into. Though they are still taking losses, they are expected to be recovered and making gains by 2021. Overall, the Nordic economies are in much better shape than the rest of Europe, and it's likely that their strategies will be referenced during future pandemics. In conclusion, during a pandemic, economic losses are virtually inescapable. But by examining the European spectrum of responses, we can deduce which methods are best for preserving economic stability for future pandemics.